Every morning, millions of people wake up tired, not just sleepy, exhausted. We rely on alarms to pull us out of bed, coffee to feel alive, screens to keep us occupied. And somehow, with all our technology, comfort, and knowledge, we still feel overwhelmed. Now here's a strange question. What if the people who lived 40,000 years ago, with no electricity, no medicine, no modern tools, were actually better at living than we are today? Not richer, not safer, but more balanced, more aware, more mentally resilient for most of history. We've been taught to picture ancient humans as crude and struggling, half-naked figures dragging clubs, barely surviving, constantly on the edge of death. But that picture is wrong, very wrong, because the humans who lived during the Ice Age had the same brains we have today. Same size, same structure, same capacity for thought, creativity, and emotion. They weren't mentally inferior, they were mentally trained in ways we no longer are. They could track animals for miles by reading footprints most people today wouldn't even notice. They could navigate entire landscapes without maps. They remembered thousands of plants, animals, seasons, and survival rules, all stored inside their minds. They didn't Google answers. They were the answers. And here's the part most people never hear. These ancient humans weren't just surviving. They were making music, creating art, caring for the sick, raising children in strong communities, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next without writing anything down. Some even performed surgery, successful surgery, using stone tools. So how did we end up believing they were stupid? Because we confuse technology with intelligence. Technology makes life easier, but it doesn't make us smarter. It just moves intelligence out of our bodies and into machines. Ancient humans had no choice. Their intelligence had to live inside them, in their awareness, their memory, their relationships, and their connection to nature. And that made them incredibly sharp. Sharp enough to survive ice ages, sharp enough to outthink giant predators, sharp enough to spread across the entire planet. In fact, there were moments when the human population dropped so low that our entire species almost disappeared, and yet we survived, not because we were the strongest animal, but because we were the most adaptable, the most cooperative, the most intelligent in ways modern life rarely rewards anymore. Tonight, we're going to strip away the cartoon image of cavemen. We're going to explore how ancient humans really lived, thought, slept, learned, and survived. And by the end, you may realize something unexpected. The people we call primitive weren't behind us, in some ways. They were ahead of us. The day usually begins the same way. A sharp sound slices through the dark, an alarm. You reach for your phone before you even open your eyes. Notifications, messages, headlines. A world demanding your attention before your body has fully woken. Up, coffee becomes mandatory, not a pleasure. The morning feels less like a beginning and more like recovery. Now pause that image. Picture a different morning, not in an apartment or a house, but somewhere in what will one day be Southern Europe. It's 40,000 years ago. There is no alarm, no glowing screen, no rush. A man opens his eyes not because something told him to, but because his body decided it was time. This alone already tells us something uncomfortable. For most of human history, waking up wasn't a battle. And the person waking up wasn't primitive, confused, or struggling to survive. He was alert, observant, and deeply connected to the world around him, long before breakfast or movement. His brain is already working, not scrolling, not reacting, but reading the environment. This is where the myth starts to crack. We've been taught to imagine cavemen as dull, grunting figures barely scraping by, cartoon characters dragging clubs, hiding in damp caves, reacting to the world. Instead of understanding it, that image is comforting, because it makes modern life feel like progress, but it isn't accurate. And archaeology has been quietly dismantling that fantasy for decades. The truth is far more unsettling. Prehistoric humans weren't intellectually behind us, in many ways. They were ahead, just fluent in a different kind of intelligence. Let's meet one of them, not a hero, not a genius by modern standards, just an average adult male from the Upper Paleolithic. He steps outside his shelter as dawn light touches the landscape. The structure behind him isn't a cave. It's a carefully engineered home, mammoth bones forming a frame, animal hides stretched and treated for insulation, multiple interior zones arranged around a central fire that has never been allowed to die. Fire, for him, isn't just warmth, it's memory, security, technology, and survival rolled into one glowing core. Before he eats, before he speaks, before anyone else fully stirs, he checks the wind, not casually, precisely. He notices its direction, speed, temperature, and smell. He studies the sky, the clouds, the way birds are moving. He kneels to examine. Tracks pressed into the soil overnight, their depth, freshness, direction, and spacing. This isn't instinct, this is analysis. He is processing more environmental data in a few quiet minutes than most modern people do in an entire day. And he's doing it without instruments, apps, or training manuals. Everything he knows lives in his head, built from experience and knowledge passed down across generations. Here's the part we rarely acknowledge. To survive in this world, you didn't get to be average. There was no safety net, no emergency services, no grocery store 3 blocks away. If you misread the weather, you could freeze. If you misjudged an animal, you could die. If you failed to notice subtle changes in the environment, your entire family might pay the price. Survival didn't reward strength alone. It rewarded intelligence, and not just one kind. These humans had to understand animal behavior, plant cycles, geography, weather patterns, material properties, social dynamics, and long-term planning, all at once. They were navigating a living system, not a simplified one, and they were doing it daily, from childhood. This is why the primitive caveman idea collapses so quickly under scrutiny, because nothing about this lifestyle allowed for cognitive weakness. And then there's the creativity. For a long time, researchers assumed art, music, and symbolic thought appeared late, almost accidentally as luxuries, once survival became easy. That assumption didn't survive the evidence. In 2008, archaeologists working in a cave in Germany uncovered a small carved fragment of mammoth ivory. At first it looked insignificant, but as more pieces were recovered and assembled, it revealed something extraordinary. A flute, not a crude whistle, not a noisemaker, a precisely engineered musical instrument, complete with carefully spaced fingerholes capable of producing structured melodies when tested. Researchers found that the spacing of the holes followed the same mathematical ratios used in modern instruments. This meant one thing: the person who made it understood sound, vibration, and harmony 40,000 years ago. Music wasn't a coincidence, it was intentional design. You don't build an instrument like that unless your brain is capable of abstract thought, planning, and aesthetic judgment. You don't create music unless your society values something beyond immediate survival. These weren't people barely hanging on. They were people with time, skill, and emotional depth. And that changes how we have to think about everything else. They did take sleep. For example, something modern humans struggle with endlessly. Insomnia, exhaustion, artificial schedules, glowing screens. We treat poor sleep like a personal failure. But when scientists studied modern hunter-gatherer societies to understand how early humans likely slept, they found something astonishing. These communities didn't suffer from insomnia, not occasionally, not rarely. It simply didn't exist. People went to sleep a few hours after sunset, not when they collapsed from exhaustion, but when their bodies were ready. They woke naturally. Often before sunrise, without alarms. Sleep was deep, uninterrupted, and consistent. Temperature, not light, governed their rhythms. As the air cooled, the body prepared for rest. As it warmed, it woke. Their shelters weren't sealed, climate-controlled. Boxes, they were connected to the natural world. And the result? Better sleep than nearly half of modern Americans report today. This wasn't luck, it was alignment. Which brings us back to the bigger question. If these people lacked modern technology, yet lived with better sleep, deeper environmental awareness, advanced art, music, engineering, medicine, and social cooperation, what exactly were they missing? The uncomfortable answer is, not much. They lacked convenience. They lacked speed. They lacked mass production. But they did not lack intelligence. In fact, they lived in a world that demanded the full use of the human brain every single day, and they rose to that demand so effectively that our species survived ice ages, predators, volcanic winters, and near-extinction events. This wasn't primitive life. It was high-performance, human life, stripped of distractions, and we're only just beginning to understand how sophisticated it really was. If you ask most people where cavemen lived, they'll give the same answer without hesitation. Caves, dark, cold, dripping caverns where half-naked humans huddled around flickering fires, barely holding on. It's one of the most persistent images in popular culture, and one of the most wrong. The truth is, caves were the exception, not the rule. Archaeological evidence from across Europe, Asia, and Africa shows that most Paleolithic humans were nomadic. They moved with the seasons, following animal migrations, plant cycles, and climate shifts. And because they moved, they built homes designed to move with them. Not crude shelters, engineered ones across Ice Age Europe. Researchers have uncovered circular and dome-shaped dwellings constructed from flexible wooden frames, mammoth bones used as load-bearing supports, and layers of carefully treated animal hides for insulation. These structures weren't improvised. They followed consistent design principles passed down through generations. Inside, space was organized with intention. Sleeping areas were placed to capture maximum warmth from the central fire. Tool-making zones were positioned where light was best. Food storage areas were separated to reduce contamination. Waste disposal zones were placed downwind. Some sites even show evidence of stone floors laid for drainage. This isn't guesswork, it's architecture. And it raises an important question. How? Do you design a portable, weatherproof, defendable home without nails, without metal, without blueprints? You need deep material knowledge. You need to understand airflow, insulation, structural tension, and thermal dynamics, and you need to understand them well enough to build quickly, repeatedly, and reliably. Which brings us to the next myth, that cavemen worked endlessly just to survive. In reality, they were astonishingly efficient. When anthropologists studied modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups living lifestyles closest to those of Paleolithic humans, they expected to find people working constantly. Driven by scarcity, what they found instead was almost the opposite. On average, these communities spent 4 to 6 hours per day on survival-related tasks. 4 to 6. The rest of their time was spent socializing, storytelling, playing games, making art, repairing tools, teaching children, resting, and simply existing within their community. Compare that to the modern world. 8 to 10 hours of work per day is considered normal, often just to afford food and shelter, and even then, many people feel like they're barely keeping up. So how did prehistoric humans manage to work less and still thrive? Because they weren't guessing. They knew exactly where food came from when it appeared, how to access it efficiently, and how to preserve it. A single adult carried an encyclopedic knowledge of their environment, hundreds of edible plants, dozens of animal species, seasonal patterns, weather signals, water sources, and medicinal resources. They weren't searching, they were executing. A foraging trip wasn't wandering and hoping. It was targeted collection based on precise timing. A hunt wasn't brute force. It was strategy, coordination, and prediction. And this knowledge wasn't written down, it lived in human memory, passed from elders to children through demonstration, participation, and storytelling. By the time a child reached adolescence, they weren't learning survival skills. They had already mastered the basics. By age 10, children in these societies could identify edible plants, manage fire, track animals, and assist in tool-making. By 15, they were fully contributing members of the group. No abstract schooling, no memorization without purpose. Every skill had immediate relevance, and this is where modern thinking often fails. We assume intelligence means specialization, knowing one thing very well. But Paleolithic intelligence was integrative. A single person needed competence across dozens of domains. Tool-making wasn't separate from hunting. Hunting wasn't separate from weather knowledge. Weather knowledge wasn't separate from migration planning. Everything connected, which is why their tools weren't crude either. Stone tools weren't random rocks smashed together. They were the result of deliberate planning, precise strikes, and deep understanding of material properties. Different tools were made for different tasks: scrapers for hides, blades for cutting, points for hunting, needles for sewing, engraving tools for art. Some stone blades discovered by archaeologists are sharper than modern surgical scalpels. That level of sharpness doesn't happen by accident. It requires understanding how force travels through stone, where fractures will occur, and how to remove material without destroying the tool. Modern researchers attempting to replicate Paleolithic toolmaking often take years to reach basic proficiency. Yet in prehistoric societies, every adult possessed these skills. This wasn't elite knowledge, it was baseline competence, and they didn't exist in isolation. Another deeply flawed assumption is that cavemen lived in small, disconnected family units, cut off from one another. The archaeological record tells a very different story. Seashells have been found hundreds of miles inland. Obsidian tools appear thousands of miles from their volcanic sources. Amber jewelry shows up far from where amber naturally forms. This means trade, and not occasional contact. Sustained networks spanning enormous distances, information traveled, with goods Techniques spread across regions. Innovations in one area appeared in another within generations. Not centuries. These people were connected through migration routes, shared traditions, and ongoing exchange. They were building the earliest human networks without writing, without roads, without maps, and within those networks, something remarkable happened. Care. Skeletons show healed fractures that would have required months of assistance. Disabled individuals lived full lives supported by their communities. Elderly members survived long past their physically productive years. These societies didn't discard the weak, they protected them, which means their social structures were stable, cooperative, and deeply human. And when the day's work was done, when food was secured and tools were maintained, life didn't stop. It opened up. People created art not because it was useful, but because it mattered. They carved figurines, crafted jewelry, painted surfaces, decorated tools, and adorned their own bodies. Art wasn't separate from life, it was woven into it. Beauty wasn't a luxury, it was a human need. All of this paints a picture that's hard to reconcile with the stereotype we've inherited. These weren't desperate creatures, barely clinging to existence. They were skilled, efficient, socially connected. Humans living in deep alignment with their environment, working less than we do, sleeping better than we do, and creating culture under conditions that would overwhelm most modern people. And this is still only the surface, because to truly understand how advanced these humans were, we need to look inside their minds at what their brains were actually capable of. That's where the story gets even more surprising. If there's one assumption modern humans cling to more tightly than any other, it's this: that intelligence naturally increases over time, that we are smarter than our ancestors simply because we live later in history. It feels logical. We have computers, satellites, medicine, and machines that think faster than any human ever could. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Archaeology keeps forcing us to confront. Technology advanced, human brains didn't. Anatomically modern humans, people with brains essentially identical to ours, have existed for at least 200,000 years. The people painting cave walls, carving flutes, and engineering shelters weren't using inferior hardware. They were using the same neural machinery sitting inside your skull right now. The difference wasn't intelligence. It was how that intelligence was trained, exercised, and required to function. And nowhere is this clearer than in the tools they made for decades. Stone tools were dismissed as simple. Rocks shaped into useful forms. Functional, yes, but hardly impressive. That view collapsed the moment neuroscientists began studying what actually happens in the brain when modern humans try to replicate ancient tool-making techniques. The results were shocking when researchers monitored brain activity in people. Learning Paleolithic stone knapping, they found that the same neural networks activated as those used by professional musicians, pianists. In particular, complex motor planning, fine-grained coordination, working memory, long-term sequencing. In other words, learning to make stone tools was as cognitively demanding as learning to play classical piano. And Paleolithic societies weren't. Filled with a few elite craftsmen, every adult had these skills. That means entire communities where the baseline level of neurological coordination and spatial reasoning exceeded what many modern people ever develop. This wasn't mindless labor, it was precision craft, and it extended far beyond tools. Take art. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira aren't random doodles. They show mastery of perspective, movement, shading, and composition. Animals are depicted in motion, layered to suggest depth, positioned to interact with the natural contours of cave walls artists used. The rock itself is part of the design. That requires advanced spatial awareness and deliberate planning. You don't create that by accident in torchlight. Then there are the figurines, the Venus of Willendorf, carved around 30,000 years ago, displays deliberate proportions, repeated stylistic conventions across regions, and a level of anatomical understanding that points to formal artistic traditions. This wasn't a one-off. Similar figurines appear across vast distances, suggesting shared cultural language, which means teaching, and teaching requires communication. This brings us to language. Spoken language doesn't fossilize, but its fingerprints are everywhere in the archaeological record. Complex tools require complex instruction. Coordinated group hunts require planning. Seasonal migrations require foresight and shared understanding. By at least 800,000 years ago, humans were organizing activities that couldn't be accomplished without structured communication, likely involving abstract concepts, future planning, and conditional thinking. This wasn't grunting and pointing, this was language, and once language existed, innovation accelerated, instead of each individual rediscovering solutions independently. Knowledge could be shared, refined, and improved across generations. Culture began evolving faster than biology. This is what made humans different. Not strength, not speed, not claws or fangs. Information, and nowhere is that clearer than in there. Relationship with fire. Fire wasn't a novelty, it was a discipline. Humans controlled fire for nearly 2 million years before agriculture ever appeared. That's an almost unimaginable span of time, 40 times longer than recorded history. Over that period, they didn't just use fire, they mastered it. Different fires served different purposes. Hot, fast-burning fires for cooking, slow, steady fires for warmth, smoky fires for preservation. Underground fires for heating stones used in earth ovens. They understood which woods burned hot, which burned clean, which produced smoke, and which smoldered for hours. Firekeeping wasn't optional. Losing fire could mean death. Some groups maintained continuous fires for months or years, carefully transporting embers during migrations. Others developed rapid fire-starting techniques using friction or sparks. Fire was their electricity, and they were experts. All of this points to a level of cognitive sophistication that's impossible to reconcile with the stereotype of primitive cavemen. These were people operating in complex systems, environmental, social, technological, without written language or external memory aids. Everything lived in their minds, and perhaps the most telling evidence of all is how they treated each other. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as brutal and disposable, survival of the fittest, everyone for themselves. But the bones tell a different story. Skeletons show individuals who survive severe injuries, crushed limbs, broken spines, debilitating conditions, and lived for years afterward. These people couldn't hunt, couldn't forage effectively. They survived because others supported them. Elderly individuals lived well past their physically productive years. Children were protected, taught, and integrated into community life. This wasn't a society that abandoned the vulnerable. It was one that understood something deeply human, that cooperation isn't weakness, it's power. And that power carried our species through ice ages, predators, famine, disease, and extinction-level events. Which brings us to the next question. If these people were so intelligent, so creative, so socially advanced, how did they survive, eh? World that was actively trying to erase them. Because intelligence alone wasn't enough. They needed resilience, adaptability, innovation under pressure. And that's where the story goes next. When we talk about intelligence today, we usually mean one thing: speed. How fast someone can process information, how quickly they can calculate, react, or recall facts. We reward test scores, credentials, and specialization. Intelligence in the modern world is narrow and quantified. But Paleolithic intelligence didn't look like that. It couldn't afford to, for early humans. Intelligence was not about speed, it was about accuracy, about reading complex systems correctly, predicting outcomes, and making decisions that didn't just affect one person, but an entire group. A single mistake could be fatal. This kind of intelligence doesn't show up on IQ tests. It doesn't live in spreadsheets or classrooms. It lives in pattern recognition, memory, intuition sharpened by experience, and an intimate relationship with the environment. And nowhere is this more evident than in one of the most surprising discoveries of the last century: prehistoric music. In 2008, deep inside a cave in southern Germany, archaeologists uncovered fragments of carved mammoth ivory. When reassembled, they formed something no one expected: a flute, complete with finger holes, positioned with mathematical precision. When scientists tested replicas of these instruments, they discovered something extraordinary. The spacing of the holes followed the same acoustic ratios used in modern musical instruments. The flute could produce a full musical scale. This wasn't accidental sound, it was deliberate design. Someone, 40,000 years ago, understood how air vibrates inside a hollow tube. They understood pitch, harmony, and resonance well enough to engineer music. And music is not trivial. Music requires abstract thinking. It requires pattern recognition, timing, emotional sensitivity, and memory. It also requires leisure, time not immediately consumed by survival, which forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. These people had space in their lives for creativity. Music wasn't a side effect of survival. It was woven into it, played around fires, used in rituals, passed between generations. Music strengthens social bonds, improves coordination, and synchronizes group behavior, all critical advantages in a dangerous world. This wasn't entertainment. It was cognitive technology, and music was only one expression of a much deeper mental architecture. Consider sleep. Modern humans treat sleep like a problem to be solved. We fight it, medicate it, track it, optimize it, and still fail. Insomnia is common. Chronic fatigue is normal. Being tired all the time is expected. But when scientists studied modern hunter-gatherer groups to understand how Paleolithic humans likely slept, the results were startling. Insomnia didn't exist, not as a concept, not as a word, not as an experience. People went to sleep when their bodies were ready, usually a few hours after sunset. They didn't collapse from exhaustion, they drifted into sleep naturally. They woke up before sunrise, without alarms, feeling rested, Researchers monitored entire communities and found that night awakenings were rare. Sleep was deep and restorative. The reason wasn't discipline, it was alignment. Their bodies were synchronized with natural temperature cycles. As the air cooled after sunset, their metabolism slowed. As it warmed before dawn, they woke naturally. They slept in environments that followed natural rhythms instead of fighting them. No artificial light, no climate-controlled boxes, no screens, hijacking circadian signals. Their intelligence wasn't just cognitive, it was biological. They understood their bodies intuitively because they lived inside natural feedback systems instead of overriding them, and this biological intelligence extended into medicine. Without microscopes, without textbooks, without chemistry labs, Paleolithic humans developed treatments that still form the basis of modern medicine. Through observation and experimentation over generations, they identified plants with real pharmacological effects. Willow bark for pain relief, the precursor to aspirin; echinacea for immune support; digitalis-containing plants for heart conditions. These weren't random guesses. They were empirical discoveries refined through trial, error, and cultural memory. But perhaps the most astonishing medical evidence comes from surgery. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls dating back thousands of years with clean, deliberate holes drilled into them, a procedure known as trepanation. In many cases, the bone shows clear signs of healing. The patient survived. This means prehistoric humans performed brain surgery using stone tools, and did it successfully. They also set broken bones, treated deep wounds, and cared for the injured long enough for recovery. Skeletons show individuals surviving injuries that would have been fatal without long-term support. Which brings us back to intelligence again, because none of this happens without planning, cooperation, and foresight. Medicine requires observation over time. It requires remembering what worked, what didn't, and under what conditions. It requires teaching and trust. It requires communities that value life beyond immediate productivity. These people were not improvising, they were practicing. And all of this was happening without writing. Every piece of knowledge, medical, musical, environmental, lived in human minds, passed orally, demonstrated physically, reinforced through ritual, story, and repetition. Memory was the database, and that forced brains to develop extraordinary capacity. Modern humans outsource memory to devices. Paleolithic humans were the devices. They carried maps of entire regions in their heads, seasonal calendars, botanical libraries, animal behavior models, weather prediction systems, tool blueprints, social histories. They were walking encyclopedias. But intelligence alone doesn't explain their success, because intelligence without cooperation collapses under pressure. To understand how humans truly became unstoppable, we need to look beyond individual minds and into collective systems. Trade, culture, and social networks that stretched across continents. That's where the real revolution begins. When we think of connection today, we imagine glowing screens, instant messages, and global networks powered by satellites and fiber optic cables. We assume deep connectivity is a modern achievement, something made possible only by technology. But long before wires and signals, humans built networks just as powerful. They did it with feet, memory, and trust. Archaeologists began noticing something strange decades ago. Objects were appearing in places they didn't belong. Seashells turned up hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline. Obsidian tools surfaced. Far from any volcanic source, amber jewelry appeared in regions where amber doesn't naturally occur. At first, these finds were treated as anomalies. Then they kept appearing, again and again and again. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore the conclusion. Paleolithic humans were connected through vast trade and communication networks stretching across entire continents. These weren't occasional exchanges between neighboring groups. They were sustained systems of contact, maintained across generations. People knew where valuable materials came from. They knew which groups controlled access. They knew how to travel long distances safely and repeatedly. In other words, they had logistics, and logistics require planning, coordination, and shared social rules. Trade wasn't just about objects, it was about information. Along with shells and stone traveled knowledge, improved hunting techniques, new tool designs, seasonal insights, stories of danger or opportunity. Innovation spread through these networks faster than most people realize. A better spear point developed in one region could appear hundreds of miles away within a few decades. Not through written manuals or formal education, through human movement and communication. This was the first information economy, and it depended entirely on social intelligence, because you don't trade with people you can't trust. Which means Paleolithic humans had to develop systems for evaluating strangers, forming alliances, resolving conflicts, and maintaining long-term relationships with people they might only see once or twice a year. Marriage exchanges strengthened bonds between distant groups. Shared rituals and artistic styles signaled cultural familiarity. Trade routes doubled as diplomatic corridors. Culture became a language if you recognized someone's tools, symbols, or songs. You knew they belonged to the same broad human network. That recognition reduced violence and increased cooperation. This wasn't accidental. It was social engineering refined over thousands of years. And nowhere was this more evident than in how they raised children. Paleolithic childhood looked nothing like modern schooling. There were no classrooms, no lectures, no abstract testing. Learning happened through participation, observation, and play embedded directly into daily life. Children weren't separated from adults. They watched tool-making, food preparation, fire management, and social negotiation from the moment they could walk. They learned by doing, not memorizing. Games weren't just games, they were training systems. Tracking games sharpened observation. Throwing games developed coordination and accuracy. Story-based games taught moral reasoning, cause and effect, and social rules. By age 10, children in these societies could identify edible plants, manage fire, track animals, and navigate landscapes. By adolescence, they weren't preparing for adulthood, they were already in it. This wasn't exploitation, it was empowerment. Children grew up knowing they were capable, useful, and needed. And that sense of competence mattered deeply. Modern psychology tells us that purpose and belonging are foundational to mental health. Paleolithic societies embedded those needs into daily life. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed in ways that mattered, which brings us to another myth worth dismantling. The early humans were constantly fighting each other. Conflict existed. Of course, competition over resources was real. Archaeological evidence shows signs of violence, defensive structures, and warfare in certain periods. But what's striking is how often humans chose cooperation instead. Trade networks weren't just economic systems, they were peacekeeping mechanisms. Groups that traded with each other were far less likely to engage in violence. Shared cultural practices reduced misunderstanding. Marriage ties created kinship across distance. These societies understood something modern geopolitics often forgets: connection reduces conflict, and when conflict did arise, it wasn't chaotic. Weapons were designed. Defensive strategies were employed, groups coordinated. Violence, when necessary, was calculated, not random. But far more often, diplomacy won because survival favored stability, and stability required social intelligence just as much as technical skill. This social intelligence extended to care for the vulnerable. Archaeological evidence shows individuals with severe disabilities, missing limbs, degenerative diseases, chronic injuries, living long lives supported by their communities. These people couldn't hunt or forage effectively. They survived because others ensured they did. Elderly members were protected long past their physical prime. Children were nurtured, not discarded. Knowledge holders were valued. This wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. Older individuals carried memories of rare events, extreme weather, famine, migration routes, past conflicts. Keeping them alive preserved knowledge that could save lives in the future. Care was an investment, and this investment paid off because when disaster struck, when climates shifted, predators migrated, or resources vanished, communities with strong social bonds survived better than those without. Which leads us to the next realization. Human success wasn't driven by individual brilliance alone. It was driven by collective intelligence, a system where knowledge accumulated, spread, and improved across generations, where no one person needed to know everything because the group knew enough together. This is what allowed humans to adapt faster than evolution alone would permit, and it's what sets the stage for the next chapter of the story. Because intelligence and social networks helped humans thrive in stable environments. But what happens when the environment turns hostile? When ice advances, predators hunt humans deliberately, volcanoes darken the sky, and extinction becomes a real possibility. That's where the true test begins. Intelligence is easy to admire when conditions are comfortable. What truly reveals it is crisis. For Paleolithic humans, comfort was rare. Stability was temporary. The world they lived in was unpredictable, violent, and often unforgiving. Climate could shift within a single lifetime. Herds migrated or vanished. Predators learned to hunt humans as deliberately as humans hunted them. Survival wasn't guaranteed, and yet, instead of collapsing under pressure, humans became more inventive. Scarcity didn't shrink their minds, it sharpened them. One of the most important developments during this period was specialization. As communities grew more complex, not everyone needed to master every skill at the same level. Some individuals became expert toolmakers, others focused on hunting strategies, some specialized in healing, ritual, navigation, or teaching. This division of labor wasn't rigid. People remained adaptable. But specialization allowed knowledge to deepen instead of spread thin. And deep knowledge changes everything. Take hunting. Early humans weren't just chasing animals with spears. They studied them. They knew migration routes, mating seasons, social hierarchies, and stress responses. They learned how animals reacted to fear, noise, and injury. This allowed for advanced hunting strategies. Drive hunts funneled entire herds into natural traps. Ambush techniques exploited terrain and wind direction. Coordinated attacks required timing, communication, and trust in many cases. Humans hunted animals larger, faster, and stronger than themselves. They didn't win through force, they won through planning. And planning requires the ability to simulate the future, to imagine outcomes before they happen. This same predictive intelligence applied to tool innovation. Stone tools evolved from simple flakes to highly refined blades, points, and composite. Weapons. Humans learned to combine materials, stone, wood, sinew, bone, into tools greater than the sum of their parts. This is engineering. Composite tools require foresight. You have to imagine how separate elements will behave once assembled. You have to anticipate stress points, balance, and durability. Mistakes weren't fatal every time, but repeated mistakes were. So designs improved, and improvements spread. Successful innovation didn't stay local. Through social networks and trade routes, better tools propagated across regions, over generations. This created technological lineages, families of tools evolving through cumulative improvement. This is something no other species has ever achieved. Animals can learn, humans accumulate, and accumulation accelerates change. But innovation wasn't limited to hunting or tools. It extended into shelter. Paleolithic homes weren't random piles of branches. Archaeological evidence shows structured dwellings with defined sleeping areas, storage spaces, hearths, and windbreaks. Some were semi-subterranean to conserve heat. Others were portable, designed for seasonal migration. These structures weren't just functional, they were psychological. Shelter created safety, privacy, and social space. It allowed humans to rest deeply, teach children, repair tools, and plan for the future. A secure shelter turns survival into living, and then there's clothing, without fur or thick body hair. Humans are biologically fragile in cold environments, yet humans spread into Ice Age. Europe, Siberia, and eventually the Americas, regions that should have been lethal. They survived because they learned to make clothing, not crude wraps, tailored garments. Needles made of bone appeared tens of thousands of years ago, complete with eye holes. This indicates fitted clothing shaped to the body, layered, insulated, and repaired. This requires planning, fine motor skills, and understanding of materials. It also requires long-term thinking. You don't make tailored clothing unless you expect to need it again. Which brings us to one of the most profound cognitive shifts of all. Humans began planning for futures they might never see. They stored food. They maintained tools they weren't using. They taught skills to children who wouldn't apply them for years. This is delayed gratification on a species-wide scale, and it changed everything. Because once humans could reliably imagine and prepare for distant futures, they stopped merely reacting to the environment. They began shaping it. Controlled burns, modified landscapes to attract game, selective harvesting encouraged regrowth. Camps were revisited seasonally, forming predictable resource hubs. Humans weren't just surviving in nature, they were engineering ecosystems. This level of influence required restraint as much as intelligence. Overexploitation would destroy future resources. Sustainable practices ensured survival across generations. This wasn't environmentalism as ideology, it was environmentalism as necessity. And perhaps the most important innovation of all wasn't a tool or technique. It was storytelling. Stories encoded survival knowledge in memorable forms. They taught children which animals were dangerous, which places were sacred, which behaviors strengthened or threatened the group. Stories preserved history, they also preserved identity. In a world without writing, stories were how humans remembered who they were, and those stories carried humans through catastrophe. Ice ages came and went, volcanoes erupted, megafauna disappeared, entire regions became uninhabitable, yet humans adapted again and again, not because they were the strongest, but because they were the most flexible. Which brings us to the final question. How did all of this intelligence, cooperation, innovation culminate in humanity's rise to global dominance? What happened when humans reached a tipping point where adaptation turned into expansion? That answer lies in the most dramatic transformation of all, the moment when culture began evolving faster than biology. There have been many moments in human history when survival felt uncertain, but nothing compares to what came before civilization. For most of our existence, humanity lived on the edge of disappearance. Small populations scattered across hostile landscapes, no surplus, no safety net, no guarantee that the next generation would exist at all. At several points, we nearly didn't. Genetic evidence suggests that early humans passed through extreme population bottlenecks, moments when the entire species may have been reduced to just a few thousand individuals. A single drought, volcanic eruption, or prolonged ice age could have ended the human story completely, and yet it didn't, not because humans were lucky, because they were adaptable in ways no other species has ever been. The Ice Age world was brutal. Vast regions were locked beneath glaciers. Temperatures plunged. Growing seasons shortened. Food sources became unpredictable. Animals migrated or vanished. For most mammals, this meant extinction. For humans, it meant innovation. Instead of retreating, humans expanded into new environments: tundra, deserts, high altitudes, dense forests, places that demanded entirely different survival strategies. Each migration forced humans to learn from scratch. New animals, new plants, new weather patterns, new dangers. But they didn't start over. They carried knowledge with them. This is the crucial difference. A human group arriving in a new environment didn't rely solely on trial and error. They brought accumulated cultural intelligence, hunting strategies, fire mastery, tool designs, social organization, and adapted it to local conditions. Culture became portable, and that portability made humans unstoppable. Consider predators. Ice Age landscapes were dominated by animals that hunted humans deliberately. Saber-toothed cats, cave lions, dire wolves, giant hyenas. These weren't background threats. They competed directly with humans for food and territory. Humans were smaller, slower, weaker, but they had one advantage predators didn't: coordination. Humans didn't face predators alone. They moved in groups. They communicated. They planned. They defended camps. They shared food and information. Fire created safe zones. Predators feared. Weapons extended human reach. Traps neutralized speed and strength. Over time, predators learned something critical. Humans were dangerous, not individually, but collectively. And once that realization spread through animal populations, the balance shifted, but predators weren't. The only threat, nature itself, was unpredictable. Volcanoes darkened skies and cooled the planet. Rapid climate shifts turned grasslands into deserts and forests into tundra. Rivers changed course. Coastlines vanished beneath rising seas. Each environmental collapse tested human flexibility, and again, humans responded not with brute force, but with reorganization. Groups split when resources grew scarce. They merged when cooperation increased survival. Social structures adapted. To population density and environmental pressure, leadership wasn't fixed. It emerged based on skill, experience, and context. A great hunter might lead during a hunt, a skilled healer during illness, an elder during migration. Authority was fluid, which made these societies resilient. When one system failed, another took its place. This adaptability extended to diet. Humans are omnivores, but Paleolithic humans took this to an extreme. When large game vanished, they turned to smaller animals. Fish, shellfish, insects, roots, tubers, and seeds. They learned preservation techniques. To store food across seasons, nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, fat became fuel, sinew became cordage, hides became shelter and clothing. This efficiency wasn't just practical, it was survival intelligence, and it allowed humans to outlast species far better adapted to single food sources. But perhaps the most remarkable survival strategy wasn't physical at all. It was psychological. Humans developed rituals, symbols, and belief systems that helped them cope with uncertainty, fear, and loss. Burial practices show care for the dead. Art appears even during periods of extreme hardship. These weren't distractions. They were stabilizers. Meaning reduces panic. Ritual creates predictability. Shared belief strengthens cohesion. In a world where death was common and the future uncertain, these systems kept groups functioning, and functioning groups survived. Over time, something extraordinary happened. Their rate of innovation increased. Tools improved faster. Art became more complex. Trade networks expanded. Symbolic systems multiplied. This period, known as the Upper Paleolithic, marks a turning point. Culture began evolving faster than biology. Ideas moved quicker than genes. And once that threshold was crossed, humanity entered a new phase. One where extinction became less likely with each generation. One where adaptation became proactive instead of reactive. But this wasn't the end of the struggle, because dominance brought new challenges, and the final transformation, the one that reshaped the planet itself, was still ahead. For most of human existence, change moved slowly. Bodies evolved over tens of thousands of years. Skills improved over generations. Survival strategies were refined, not reinvented. Then, something shifted around 40 to 50,000 years ago. The archaeological record changes pace. Tools diversify rapidly. Art becomes symbolic and abstract. Long-distance trade expands dramatically. Burial practices grow more elaborate. This period, often called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, marks a fundamental turning point. Human evolution stopped being driven primarily by biology and started being driven by culture. This doesn't mean brains suddenly grew larger. They didn't. Human anatomy remained essentially the same. What changed was how information moved and how fast it accumulated. Ideas began stacking. A tool wasn't just copied, it was improved. A story wasn't just told, it was refined. Knowledge no longer vanished when a skilled individual died. It lived on in others. Culture became self-sustaining. One of the clearest signs of this shift is symbolic thinking. Earlier humans used symbols, but now symbols multiplied. Abstract markings, patterns, and figurative art spread across continents. Cave paintings depicted not just animals, but scenes, hunts, rituals, interactions. Symbols allowed humans to represent ideas that weren't physically present. This is a cognitive leap. Symbols let humans plan more effectively, coordinate larger groups, and imagine futures beyond immediate experience. They allowed for identity, group membership, shared myths, collective memory. Symbols created nations. Before borders existed, language likely became more complex during this period as well. Not because humans suddenly learned to speak, but because increased cultural complexity demanded greater expressive power. Words evolved to describe abstract concepts: time, obligation, belief, ancestry. Language became a tool not just for coordination, but for thought itself. This accelerated innovation further. When you can describe an idea precisely, you can transmit it intact. When others understand it clearly, they can improve it. Knowledge compounds. This is the engine of human dominance, and it didn't stop at tools and stories. It reshaped social structures. Group sizes increased. Camps became semi-permanent. Networks expanded. Humans began interacting regularly with people they weren't directly related to. Trust extended beyond kinship. This required new systems, shared rituals, moral codes, and social norms that regulated behavior. Cooperation at scale demanded predictability. Culture provided it. And culture also reshaped how humans saw themselves. Burial practices during this period reveal a growing sense of identity and continuity. People were buried with objects, pigments, and symbols. Some graves suggest status differences, while others emphasize community belonging. Death became meaningful, not just inevitable. This psychological shift mattered. A species that understands itself as part of a story behaves differently than one living moment to moment. It plans further ahead, it invests in the future, and it becomes harder to eliminate. Another hallmark of this era is artistic explosion. Art appeared everywhere, on cave walls, tools, bodies, and everyday objects. This wasn't decoration for decoration's sake. Art communicated identity, belief, and shared experience. Art made culture visible, and visible culture is harder to lose, because once identity is externalized, it can be taught, defended, and preserved. This cultural density created feedback loops. More culture encouraged more learning created more innovation. More innovation expanded networks. Larger networks accelerated cultural exchange. The result was exponential growth, not in population, but in capability. Humans became generalists with specialist knowledge. They could adapt to almost any environment. They could reorganize their societies in response to pressure. They could survive shocks that wiped out more rigid species. But this transformation came with consequences. As humans expanded, other species declined. Megafauna disappeared. Ecosystems changed. Human success reshaped the planet. This wasn't malice. It was inevitability. A species capable of cumulative culture will always outcompete those without it. And by the end of the Upper Paleolithic, the outcome was clear. Humans were no longer just surviving. They were dominating. Yet something subtle had begun to change. As culture grew more complex, humans became more dependent on it. Skills, once held by everyone, became specialized. Knowledge moved from individual memory to shared systems. The seeds of modern life were planted, and with them, a quiet trade-off. What? Humans gained in scale, they slowly lost in direct connection to environment, to body, to instinct. That trade-off would shape everything that followed, and it raises one final question. If ancient humans were so intelligent, so resilient, so deeply integrated with the world, what did we lose along the way? Modern life feels powerful. We command machines that cross oceans in hours. We store entire libraries in our pockets. We bend nature to our will with steel, concrete, and code. From the outside, it looks like progress. But progress always asks a quiet question in return. What did it cost? Ancient humans lived with constant uncertainty, yet their lives were deeply integrated. Their intelligence wasn't fragmented into professions, apps, or institutions. It was embodied, lived, practiced every day. They understood their environment because their survival depended on it. Weather wasn't background noise, it was information. Animals weren't abstractions, they were teachers. Time wasn't measured by clocks, it was felt through cycles. Their minds were tuned to reality in ways modern humans rarely experience. As culture grew more complex, humans slowly offloaded that intimacy. Skills became specialized, knowledge moved into systems, memory was shared instead of personal. This allowed societies to scale, but it also created distance. Distance from the land, distance from the body, distance from each other. Modern humans rarely know where their food comes from. We sleep under artificial light. We override natural rhythms with schedules and alarms. We navigate landscapes with maps instead of memory. None of this makes us stupid, but it does change how intelligence is expressed. Ancient humans trained awareness. Modern humans train efficiency. Ancient humans developed resilience through exposure. Modern humans develop comfort through control. Neither is inherently better, but they are different. And understanding that difference matters, because many of the struggles people face today, anxiety, disconnection, chronic stress, aren't failures of modernity. They're mismatches. Bodies evolved for rhythm, minds evolved for meaning, communities evolved for cooperation. When those systems fall out of alignment, intelligence doesn't vanish, it turns inward. The lesson of ancient humans isn't that we should abandon technology or return to caves. It's that intelligence takes many forms, and we've narrowed our definition. Ancient humans weren't brilliant because they were primitive. They were brilliant because they were present. They paid attention, they remembered, they adapted. They built lives where survival demanded engagement, not distraction. And in doing so, they became the most resilient species Earth has ever known. Their story is not one of inferiority, it's one of continuity. Every human alive today carries the same cognitive architecture that carved flutes from ivory, painted walls in darkness, crossed frozen continents, and survived extinction-level events. That capacity didn't disappear, it just changed context, which means it can be reawakened through attention, through learning, through reconnecting with how we evolved to think, feel, and live. We don't need to become ancient humans again. We just need to remember that we are their descendants, and that intelligence isn't measured only by what we build, but by how well we live. Asterisk, asterisk. If this story changed how you think about human intelligence, resilience, or history, take a moment to sit with that feeling, because the past isn't distant, it's inside you. Every instinct, every emotion, every spark of creativity carries echoes of a world where survival depended on awareness, cooperation, and meaning. If you'd like to explore more stories like this, slow, thoughtful journeys into human history designed to inform, calm, and reconnect, consider subscribing to the channel. These aren't stories meant to rush you, they're meant to stay with you. And if you're listening late at night, let this reminder settle gently. You come from survivors, and that still matters.